to Talking Supply Chain. In each episode, top supply chain industry professionals and the nation's top thought leaders join host Brian Strait and share their unique insights to help supply chain managers stay one step ahead of their competition. This is Talking Supply Chain. Have you been in a meeting lately where tariffs were discussed? If you haven't, you probably don't work in the supply chain. Hello, and welcome to this episode of the Talking Supply Chain podcast. I'm your host, Brian Strait, and thank you for taking a few minutes to join us for this episode. Today, we're going to talk tariffs and some of the impacts both potential and real tariffs are having on our industry today. And to do that, we're joined by Tracey Ortiz, Director of Product Management at SPS Commerce. Tracey, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Brian. Nice to be here.
Great. I'm excited to do this. Obviously, there's been a lot of tariff talk of late, so we're going to get into some of that, some of the impacts it's having. To get started, though, before we even do that, can you tell us a little bit about your background and a little bit about SPS Commerce for those that may not be familiar with you guys?
Sure, I would love to. So for my background, I come from actually freight forwarding and logistics, so not in the SaaS solutions at all. I have very little tech background, but I came from a freight forwarder, mid-sized, was VP of global logistics for that freight forwarder. And so I dabbled in warehousing, transportation logistics, international trade compliance, a little bit of development, and managed the overall product. So then the company made some shifts, and I decided that I wanted to try something a little bit different, but sort of still in the same realm. So I decided I would look to SPS Commerce. They had a really great 3PL product that they had introduced under 2 years from that time. And so I happened to know somebody at SPS Commerce and reached out, and there was a director role. So it's been SPS Commerce is a supply chain SaaS solutions company. They began with their retail customers and then moved on to a supplier product fulfillment, and then to 3PL logistics, where they developed a 3PL product so that their 3PL customers could make connections to their suppliers, their customers. And so what they were looking for is somebody with operations logistics experience in the market who could come in and influence the product currently and then as it grew. And so I've now been there for almost 10 months. There's been a lot to learn, big learning curves for me, but it's been fantastic.
Yeah, and what a time to join the company, right? I mean, 10
No
months, you
kidding,
jumped right
right?
into it, right?
Yeah, no kidding. Yeah, it was very interesting timing for sure.
So there has been a lot of talk about tariffs, obviously for obvious reasons. I have had a number of conversations with people. Supply Chain Management Review, our publication has published a number of pieces on tariffs, but a lot of those pieces look at how to mitigate the damage and things like that. I think I want to jump in with you, at least initially in this conversation. We want to talk about the actual impacts that we're seeing because of this. For instance, like the last couple months, I think we've seen a lot of inbound container traffic coming to this country. I think as good as companies try to bring goods in ahead of the tariffs and before they have to pay extra costs. So, can you talk about what the impact that is having on the ground in the warehouse and logistics markets?
I sure can. And it's an interesting and sort of passionate topic for me, as I ran warehousing previously and did all leases and everything else. And so I'm aware of market rates continually for warehousing. So it's
Mhm.
been very interesting to see this um, throughout it was late October through January. There was a huge surge in container traffic coming into the 10 largest ports, which saw um, approximately 14% year over year increase in inbound container volume, which is very significant. One of the biggest, obviously, effects to that would be the higher demand for warehouse space. Companies were stockpiling, like you said, inventory to hopefully avoid future tariffs. And then what happens is there's a shortage of warehouse space. And like during COVID initially, that drives up the rates, which is, of course, just a double-edged sword for the companies that are, trying to get ahead of it, because now they have to store it all and there's higher rates. So it probably in the end doesn't end up saving a lot, but it felt like there needed to be something done. And so that was the first thing that they could do to make an impact. And I think then, when you think about that, if we're moving along the line here from a supply chain perspective, then you end up with pressure on warehouse operations because inevitably, if a customer is looking for space, a warehouse is going to take in every possible piece of freight that they can. That's their business and that's how they make money. And then a lot of really well laid plans and processes go to the wayside because there has to be space within a warehouse in order to properly execute on the process. And so it becomes inefficient. And really, I mean, it's more difficult probably behind the scenes on 3PL warehouses than is visible to the suppliers that are shipping to them.
Yeah.
Um, Labor as well. Then they're facing labor shortages because there's not a lot of warning a lot of times in a 3PL warehouse. So you can have loads show up and either not know or not have very much notice. The temp agencies, they benefit from that, right? Because then what ends up happening is they need to call temp agencies and get temporary employment in there.
Yeah.
That having been said, um, those employees aren't trained in the process. And so it ends up becoming sort of this hamster wheel of chaos until they can determine how to flatten that out, if you will.
Yep.
I
So,
think, yeah, sorry, go
no,
ahead.
no, I'm sorry. Do you continue? Yeah, I was.
I was going to say that I think the biggest effect there is also turnover because employees who were happy with the process may end up being unhappy because everything feels chaotic and there isn't really any end in sight, and so that's another
Yeah.
fallout there.
Yeah. And so there's a lot of downstream impacts to these things and what's going on. I think one of the big ones to me seems to be, as you mentioned, like as companies stockpile goods, um, warehouse space disappears, rents rise because people can't get space, right? So, typical supply and demand situation. And that's kind of what we saw coming out of COVID too, right? I mean, the same sort of thing. And and I don't know how much factor this played in the freight recession that we've gone through the last couple of years, right? But I mean, it certainly will have an impact. So, is there concern that we are kind of revisiting the post-COVID years here?
Yeah, a little bit actually. And it's very familiar to me because I was in that space, in the logistics and warehousing space during COVID. And the similarities are becoming eerie for sure. They're obviously, like we just discussed, companies were preemptively increasing inventory levels. They want to avoid disruptions because the tariffs and the cost is not the only concern in a situation like this. We end up with higher transportation costs
Mhm.
and then capacity within transportation companies. And so the surge in demand for warehouse space is huge. And I think, you know, we would be remiss in saying that this isn't much like COVID. That having been said, depending upon the economy, in COVID, the rates did drop on warehouse space and level out a little bit at some point, and then we ended up with the extra warehouse space because there was this, need to build. But there's absolutely the same constraints and the same level of initial chaos that was experienced during COVID. So what will be interesting to see is what did 3PL warehouses and suppliers alike learn from COVID, as well as freight forwarders, so that maybe we can mitigate a little bit of that given the similarities.
Yeah. I think one of my fears would be that I think just in general, not not every company's like this, obviously, but some companies just very bad from learning from history, right? And they don't
This is
follow.
true. Yes.
And my fear
Yeah.
would be that some companies look at it and say, well, that was because of COVID. This is something different, right? When I
That's
think
a
there's enough
real possibility.
similarities. Yeah.
Sure. Well, and I guess too, since you mention it, right? Turnover happens. COVID is now 5 years ago.
Yeah.
And so there could very easily be, management leadership within warehouses and within the supplier companies that are different and maybe didn't experience it in the right way. So you could be absolutely correct. It could repeat itself all over. We have to hope not. Because as a nation and then globally, we certainly don't want to see the shortages and the impacts on households that we did. So we'll hope for the best, but you make a very good point.
Yeah. Are there economic impacts beyond just the rent and maybe some rising transportation costs or lowering transportation costs if things just stop moving because the warehouses are full?
So the answer to that is yes. The economic impacts are they begin with obviously the rising costs, right? Which
Right.
are, look, it's like anything else. It's advantageous, and transportation companies and warehouses alike won't necessarily be aiming to take advantage of it, but will need to recoup their costs in increased labor and other things. Um, the other thing I want to note too is that, and this is where, SPS Commerce comes into play as well, is that if they can pull it off in a short period of time, 3PLs are going to be looking and carriers are going to be looking for automation to solve for some of these pain points, right?
Yeah.
These manual processes that have continued on for decades probably will have to have a more strategic approach now that we're in this space to hopefully mitigate disaster and just to streamline and speed up process. So with
Yeah.
that, there's a cost as well that we didn't address, right? And that's a significant cost. Um, the other issue is that there's agreements made between retailers and suppliers, right? And when suppliers can't keep up for various reasons, if the 3PL can't keep up or the carriers aren't delivering, then there's, potential chargebacks related to that from retailers to suppliers. And then is it, suppliers to 3PLs? And so it becomes this sort of um really undocumented space in where there's going to end up being some finger pointing and sorting out while they get
Yeah.
through this space. So there is economic pressure there as well.
So yeah, so it's definitely beyond, I think, what we more in the broader picture, we just kind of think about there's extra cost for the tariff that we have to pay, or maybe a rent has gone up in one of our facilities as a result. There's a lot of
Absolutely.
other costs that companies need to be aware of and consider in some of
Absolutely.
this.
And then as consumers, right, we see the effect of that.
Yeah.
We have to, because margins have to stay up in order for companies to continue to pay supply chain companies to pay their employees and the costs of potential automation. And so, as we know, as consumers, we will see the effect of that.
Yep. One of the things we saw in COVID times, it seems so long ago now, honestly, but
It really does, doesn't it? It
yeah,
does and it doesn't. I mean, this brings it back for sure, but no, you're absolutely right.
yeah. One of the things that we saw during that time was companies change their strategies. We saw much more focus on
Mhm.
nearshoring, et cetera. A lot of things have been documented. Are you seeing similar changes in distribution strategies going on because of the tariffs?
100%, yes. Um, and I think those began back in the fall as
Right.
the retailers, suppliers, manufacturers were aware of the fact that this was likely happening. They had to, form focus groups and figure out what they would do to mitigate some of this. Some of the things they can do is they're going to reevaluate their entire supply chain, right? So that means everything from overseas to domestic to their 3PL and their carrier. And so with that, they can change their routing. There's there's a lot of shift towards nearshoring, so sourcing from nearby companies instead, bringing back production within, the US, which we've already seen some of, right, from the auto manufacturers. There's distribution changes that they can make, meaning do we secure temporary warehouse space in multiple geographical areas so that if there is capacity constraints and issues within the carrier market, there's a shorter distance to go, or if it's package as well for UPS, FedEx, and DHL, there's a shorter distance to go from their temporary DCs to their customers.
Yeah.
So there's a lot that goes into the thought behind how they can restructure their their supply chain approach during times like this. Also, inventory, right? I mean, there's going to be, obviously, there was an influx. Then at some point, they've got to level that out. And then they have to determine if products are going up in price based on whatever their raw material was, right, from overseas, then is their inventory spikes and drops? Do we need the same amount of inventory in the same geographical areas? I think it's, from my perspective, far more complex probably than either you or I or a lot of people can understand in relation to what sells in what geographical areas and where they have to adjust. But there's undoubtedly not likely an extra focus group hired, which means that those who are involved in the changing and eradicating of those processes are working a lot of long hours to figure out how they're going to shore up inventory and change their supply chain process.
Yeah, and I want to follow up on that, but before we get that, I want to ask you, so as what you just described there, should companies be looking at that as a cost mitigation issue and approach, or should they be looking at it from an inventory management approach? Because I think
I
there's
think it's a bit of
different
both.
approaches. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's a bit of both. Because the more inventory that you hold, the more cost you have. And if the warehouse rates are going up, then you're going to have dead stock
Yeah.
that you'll either be forced to drastically reduce in cost to clear out or continue to pay for. So it's cost mitigation, but then it's also just relearning um, how to adequately, for buyers and planners, this will be very, very intricate and strategic.
Hmm.
How to have real-time understanding of what you're selling, what you're turning, what's in demand, and having near perfect amounts of inventory in those warehouses to make sure that a couple of things. One, the inventory can be located easily. Because again, like I mentioned earlier, when you run out of space in a warehouse, things are not as organized. And just having that, I mean, this is a time, Brian, where having that automation, WMS, and inventory connections with their supplier is going to be very important so that everybody has an understanding of what's on hand at all times.
Yeah. Yep. As the inventory moves around, right, and
Mhm.
especially, I think this goes to the stockpiling issue that we may be seeing a little bit of now, right? As space
Yep.
disappears, companies may need to move inventory somewhere else than where it traditionally
Mhm.
has been, right? Because there's just no space in the local area. So,
Yep.
I mean, if we're all in, I mean, all of us are in the business of satisfying the customer, right? We obviously know the 1 day shipping, 2 day shipping, that sort of thing, make sure the stuff's on the shelves in stores. So as this inventory kind of moves around, as space dries up, costs go up, how is that factoring into the ability to actually service the customer and their needs and desires and satisfaction?
That's a great question. Because that's the biggest concern, right? Is their most valuable customers are going to potentially, in their mind, experience some interruption. What I
Right.
will say is that there will be levers pulled at last minute. One of the, in my opinion, at least early on here, when there hasn't been enough of an effort for nearshoring or reshoring yet, right? Because they have to determine where they can procure these supplies here in the US.
Yeah.
The industry that will benefit from this greatly is going to be the expedite industry. If it's domestically, right, it's ground package and then it's air freight for those carriers because there is the opportunity to air freight parts and or supplies from overseas last minute if needed in order to make sure that a customer isn't disappointed. Is there a
Yeah.
cost to that? Yes. What'll be interesting is to watch and see with some of these, let's look more at the larger companies, right? Who it'll be evident immediately, large retailers who use suppliers, large suppliers, just to see what the comparison is between that last minute expedite shipping and holding extra inventory. And where does that level out for them? Because
Yeah.
as this happens, it's expected, obviously, that air freight costs will go up as well. So there's going to be a whole lot of strategy behind that to figure out what works best.
Yeah. I think you talk about that e-commerce. I'm guessing that it, an e-commerce customer that orders something expects it in a day or two. And
Yeah,
you know, at some point, the company has to make the decision that I am going to eat the extra freight cost to get that there to them in that 2 day time frame. Because if I don't
absolutely.
get it there, then I may get no more business from that customer going forward, right? So it's that
Yes.
long-term view of customers that I think companies probably have to balance with these costs.
Agreed. Agreed. And what I think is important is that when these suppliers are using expedite services to make sure that the customer gets it, learning from that, right? And saying, okay, we've now seen whatever, two, three cases in the last day of where this particular product or product line has had to be expedited. Okay, buyers and planners, we are unfortunately going to have to take on some inventory cost here because we still have a demand with this product and we're not able to meet it.
Yeah. So I think that that's really good. I wanted to ask about technology. I think that kind of rolls into the next question I was going to get to anyway, and that is what actions are companies taking as they try to combat some of the impacts you've talked about today? And I think just importantly, what technologies might they have already in-house that they can leverage, and what technology should they be thinking about investing in to deal with some of these issues?
That's a great question. I know I touched on that briefly before, but to expand on that a little bit, the technologies that they have in the way of their warehouse management systems absolutely need to be leveraged on the 3PL side.
Hmm.
The real question would be a lot of 3PLs still are using the WMS for their own purposes, but not purchasing and not investing in EDI connection to their suppliers, right? So something very, I mean, unfortunately archaic as the 3PL has a WMS system. They have obviously inventory recorded, and then rather than connecting through EDI to exchange that information with their supplier, they are, you know, exporting a report into Excel and sending it via email. And so it becomes, and then it's not real time, right? So there has to be multiple exports. And this happens more often than I think all of us would like to believe. And so what is really important in a time like this is for 3PLs and suppliers alike to be able to communicate in real time and understand where those inventory levels are at, especially with e-commerce because it's ever changing, right? By the minute. And so there has to be a real understanding of that more so than any other time because of expedite costs, because of cost of too much inventory. And so that would be my advice would be to look towards those EDI solutions where we have real time understanding of what inventory looks like.
It's almost as if the last 10 years when companies were yelling, you need to get visibility, right? All of
Oh,
a sudden, you
sure.
need visibility.
100%. And I came from that space, right? The other thing that, coming from large enterprise customers, in my case, manufacturers that I managed, it was, I mean, look, they were ahead of the curve in what they were expecting from freight forwarders, 3PLs, and carriers, right? And a lot of that is related to analytics, right? You have the PO data, you understand what you've shipped, what you've received. So getting those analytics in front of suppliers right now is of the utmost importance because then the buyer teams, the planner teams have the historic data, and not historic meaning a year ago, because quite honestly, that's irrelevant right now. But even over a 30-day period, what did this look like? What were the impacts, right? Economically, were there any holidays in there, any peak times, so that they're able to better predict exactly what inventory they will need.
Yeah. Yep. And there is a lot of, I know that question that just asked you, it's a huge question. I mean, we could do a 3 hour podcast
For sure,
just
yeah.
on that question and all the solutions. So I know you just touched on a couple of things there. So I appreciate that. There is a lot more that companies can do from a technology standpoint, risk mitigation, sustainability, customer service things. There's a lot of things that you can do, and a lot of technologies that are out there that
Yes.
companies can invest in if they don't already have these things that can kind of help. I do want to keep going a little bit here and um,
Sure.
get into just some strategies. I think these are things that people have touched on in the past too, but I just want to ask you that because the supply chain is global. I know one of the pushes of the tariffs is to bring manufacturing back domestically, right? But
Yes,
even products that are made domestically oftentimes rely on goods or components or raw materials that may come from somewhere else, right?
that's
Because the
correct.
US just does not have everything here. Um,
Correct.
so, for companies that kind of deal these things, in these issues, what kind of strategies do you suggest that they look at to mitigate it? And they probably can't address these things this today, right? This month, because moving
No,
supply chains suppliers is a big process
it
to do
is.
and costly. So, but from a long-term impact, so that as these issues continue to take place for companies, what kind of strategies do you suggest that they look to kind of deal
No,
with this
yeah,
long
that's a
term?
great question. It's something too that I feel like was not maybe initially understood, maybe not globally, but certainly here at home in the US, is that buying American means that one single little click on the product had to happen here in the
Yep.
US, right? But it doesn't address the raw materials. And for most products, as you just outlined, the raw materials are coming from overseas. Just from a cost perspective, that's been the way that we've been able to keep costs down. So my advice is certainly there's going to need to be, should this be long term, significant investment in our infrastructure here in the US in order to be able to produce those products here. Some of that's beginning to happen. My first advice would be to look to source locally, obviously, anything that you can. It may mean changing the manufacturing process or, sort of how things are put together. Um, their process on the line. However, that can't be immediate, like you said. And
Mm.
so, really, then what you're left with is to start to look for alternative suppliers that are in the low tariff or tariff exempt regions. That helps reduce the most immediate exposure to tariffs and the tariff related costs. It's not easy though, like you said, that isn't easy, right? Changing suppliers can cause interruption in supplies, in raw materials, and can shut down lines. It can definitely put drop ship companies and e-commerce companies in a place where they are concerned about getting their customers their product. So my advice would be to start to feather that in, right? To continue to take on some of those costs while you begin to um, dip the toe in those other areas where it is low tariff or tariff exempt,
Mm.
and sort of have a mix of both until they can, get on the same page as to what the go forward strategy is long term.
Yeah. And I think if you kind of touch this, I think I know where your answer will go to this question, but the strategies that companies should take now, and I've read all sorts of different things. I mean, I read one person on LinkedIn who posted this long. He was in, I think it was a consulting business or something, and he
Mhm.
said that companies basically just need to suck it up and deal with the tariffs, right? Because the idea of moving supply chains, moving suppliers for a policy that may only be in effect for this current administration, right? And 4 years from now may change. Like it's just it doesn't make sense, right? It was his philosophy, and there's others that say no, you've got to do these things, you've got to move them, and I think you touched on some of the strategies and things up, but from the big picture standpoint, how do companies think about tariffs? How do they need to think about this question? Do they think about it as a short-term disruption that we mitigate, or do they think about this from a long-term perspective and maybe say, hey, maybe this is an opportunity to make our business more resilient 5, 10 years from now?
That's a great question. In my opinion, so although I don't disagree with the reference that you spoke to about, companies having to sort of suck it up and accept the tariffs, I see that as a very short term answer
Yeah.
because we don't know that these are temporary, right? Everybody would love to believe that this administration a couple things could happen, right? Maybe this administration eases up on the tariffs. Perhaps there's a change in administration in 4 years, but what if there's not?
Yep.
And so I'm with your thought late there when you said, what do we do long term? I think it's an excellent time, albeit not optimal when costs are
Right.
up, for companies to start to really look at where they're sourcing, what makes up their products, and how they can get a process in place that serves them long term, even if it doesn't need to. And one of those too is looking at the tariff codes, right? So
Mhm.
an example that was given, I was speaking to a former colleague a couple of weeks ago, and we were talking about, I worked for a forwarder, right? So trade compliance is a huge part of that, and HTS codes. And we were talking about how sometimes it's as simple as changing one small description, or component of a product that changes the HTS code slightly and has less of a tariff, and
Oh,
or looking at where you can source that material elsewhere. I think that, and it is my opinion that this should not be viewed as a short-term problem, and that initially, yep, they've got to just do what they need to do for the consumer. But that's just from the standpoint of not disappointing. There are going to be costs passed on, as much as they don't want to have that happen. And if it's the suppliers, manufacturers, retailers that are sucking this up on behalf of the consumers, then they will be forced to lay off, and then, gosh, quality goes down, and all of those things. So technology is important. Understanding their tariff codes is very important. And I think this is an opportunity over the next year to restructure in a way that they are more resilient should anything like this come up again, because it
yeah.
it will. It's been proven, right? So, and it might not be tariffs, it could be other shortages or constraints. Yeah, I feel like
Yeah.
it needs to be planned for like it's forever, and let's hope that it's not.
You mentioned just the changing the wording, right? And some of that.
Mhm.
And my immediate thought went to the kids in high school who say, "Well, I'm just going to go into logistics. I don't need to learn English." Right? Like,
Oh
right.
gosh,
But
right?
but it turns out like language matters in contracts and things. And
Incredibly.
yeah, and this is a good
Mhm.
example of how important word choice is.
Well,
You know,
Brian, it's as simple, literally, when you look at tariff code, which I have, painstakingly for years, and it can be as simple as zipper versus closure,
yeah,
right? It can be as simple as padded versus foam. It's it's very interesting how easily a tariff code could drop by 10% just based on how the product is described. Now, in
describe.
some cases, there has to be a change in how it's packaged, right? Or a small component that's within it. That can also happen.
Yeah,
But again, understandably and sympathetically, it costs money to have teams of professional individuals who are looking at those codes. So it's not a short-term fix at all.
yeah, yeah. I want just one quick follow up, just really briefly. I mean, you talked about some of the things there. How important is it for organizations to get involved in trade associations and other things that can advocate for them on their behalf? I mean, I know there's a lot of companies out there that don't get involved in these things.
It's extremely important. Um, it just is, right? It's because because of what I just said.
Yeah,
Otherwise, you could be stringing together a group of people internally in an organization who maybe don't have all of the answers or all of the resources to get those answers. And the last thing you want to do is waste time and money right now, because it's at a premium. So it's very important. And the other thing is, like, for suppliers, retailers, manufacturers to lean on each other in a time like this, right? It doesn't, it's competitors to a certain extent have to go out the door, right? There has to be sort of a community approach to this, in where the more they can read, the more they can understand about what other companies alike are doing in
Mm.
this space is going to benefit them because it's free information. It's out there and they're going to band together. I know it will happen.
Yeah. Yeah. You just talked about community approach. I want to jump. I want to get to one last question here as we wrap
Sure.
up in the final few minutes left. And that is, you've talked about this a lot. Tariffs aren't just a price concern. There's a lot of impacts that are taking place in warehousing, logistics, decision making, marketing, and sales, right? Sourcing strategies, and then many more impacts that they are having. So, just kind of to wrap up the whole conversation, can you kind of just talk for a minute about what advice you can offer a company as they consider how to address the tariff situation? And I think to my perspective is this something that is a logistics problem? Is it a marketing problem, or does this need to be a C-suite approach?
I'm so glad you asked me that because I have a passion for that as well, right? Having worked in kind of all three. So it's here's what I will say. It's an operations problem.
Mhm.
And the reason I say that is because it is of the utmost importance right now that this isn't just a finance problem or a C-suite problem, right? Or a tech problem. It's all hands on deck, but most importantly, it's understanding the day-to-day and really bringing into the fold those operations professionals and even within, warehouse who there's lots of ideas out there. And the best advice that I can offer, honestly, is to listen to everybody because the boots on the ground during the day to day, have a lot of great ideas and a much better understanding of how things are moving, what constraints are being had, what processes are so manual that they are causing more issues now than they were before. And so I think, Brian, it is a combination of all, but um, it'd be prudent right now for C-suite to listen to the day-to-day operations and make sure that they are impacting the decisions going forward.
Yep. Yep. This is a big issue, obviously, for businesses right now, and trying to manage through this.
Well,
Again,
absolutely.
yeah, and I
Yes.
think just think back from the COVID times, because I think there are probably lessons that you certainly can learn from COVID that you can apply here as well. But I do think, as you
Absolutely.
mentioned, I think the long-term thinking is really important here as well, because we don't know
It
what's going to
is.
happen.
And
So,
I mean, it's something that I like to call it's change management, but it's also behavioral management
yeah,
within an organization, right? So if you're a 3PL, more so if you're a supplier, understand where there's fat to trim, understand what your expedite costs are and why. Understand what your inventory levels are, and make sure that there's eyes on every piece of your supply chain along the way so that anywhere that there can be fat trimmed, there is. But what's difficult is for a department like finance, for example, it's easy to just look at a P&L, right? Look at a spreadsheet or software and say, we just simply cannot afford to spend this anymore. Talk to the operations, understand why it's happening. And maybe there is behavioral management there, maybe there's change management, but it also could be that that was the best solution at the time.
yeah, 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 a big issue, obviously. So, Tracy,
Yeah.
thank you very much for your time today. Glad you could join us
You're
and
welcome,
talk about
Brian.
this.
It was great. I appreciate it.
People who may want to learn more, get in touch with SPS Commerce, some of the solutions you guys offer. Is there a good way for them to get in touch with you guys?
Yes. So please, SPS Commerce, our website, please go there. And if there's a particular product that is of interest, you will have a path to get to sales marketing there. But also, if there's industry, people that have listened to this and want to reach out to me. And that goes for potential customers as well. If they reach out to me at Ortiz at spscommerce.com, then I will make sure that I direct them in the right
Right.
way.
Great. Thank you, Tracy. Obviously, tariff discussions are not going away, so we may be revisiting this soon as well.
I
So
would love to. I would love to.
thank
Thank
you
you,
again so
Brian.
much. We are out of time. I want to thank my guest today, Tracy Ortiz of SPS Commerce, and of course, all of you who took time out of your day to listen to us. We greatly appreciate it. A new episode of Talking Supply Chain comes out each Thursday. You can find it on scmr.com or wherever you get your podcasts. So be sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode. Until next time, this is Brian Straight. Thank you for listening. Talking Supply Chain is produced by Supply Chain Management Review and Peerless Media. You can find it on scmr.com, supplychain247.com, iTunes, Google Podcasts, or wherever you find your podcasts. For more information on this topic or to sign up for our weekly newsletter, a print or a digital subscription to our publication, visit scmr.com. We hope you will join us for our next episode. For Supply Chain Management Review, I'm Brian Straight, and thank you for listening.